think we're way into the, if I'm looking at this correctly, I need to go way back. You get to see the entire deck in reverse. This is going to be kind of cool. Let's see how much of it you remember when I actually start at the beginning. So I am Principal Content Strategy at Think Company, experience design firm in Philadelphia. Come out and visit us sometime. Almost there. And current slide. Oh, yeah. So if you want to tweet during this, our hashtag will be content. Oops, slides went away. And I want to begin by telling you about an experiment that any of you can do if you happen to have an audience and a projector. What you do is you show the audience this photo and you ask, should this person drive this car? And what you will get is a policy discussion. You will get people on one side saying, old people are bad at everything, don't let them drive. And you'll have another group saying, that's ageist, people should do whatever they want. And all you will learn at the end of that conversation is who is on what side. Now you can show this exact same photo to a different audience and ask, how might this person drive this car? You will get a design discussion. And all you will learn at the end of that discussion is different ways that person might drive that car. Let's move the steering wheel. Let's change how the car is configured. Now, online and frankly in person, we are very, very good, and we have platforms to support the how, the policy conversation, the should conversation, I should say, right? If you go on Twitter, if you go on Facebook, you can very quickly determine who is on what side. Those platforms are excellent for that. What we don't have quite so much of are platforms and content strategies that support the how conversation, the design conversation, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. So the example I gave you comes from a guy named David Bornstein, who currently writes for the Fixes column for the New York Times. He also co-founded the Solutions Journalism Network. Their basic premise is that journalism for a very long time has been very good at the muck-raking story, the what people are doing wrong, which is a vital, key function of journalism. But, he says, it's not the only function of journalism. Journalism is also indebted to all of us to point out when things are going unusually well. What is that one school district doing that no one else is doing that somehow their scores are always higher? What is this one intervention for people coming out of prison that's working so much better than all these others? That's how story is an important story to tell as well. Another person working on this sort of thing is Robert Fursh, who's the president of Convergence. This is a policy center in DC whose job it is to bring people who are utterly on opposite sides of an issue together. We're going to talk a little more about them later, but he had to say about the founding of it, over a period of years, I kept meeting people of great decency who had different worldviews, but there wasn't a place where they could meet to bring out the best in each other and find answers each hadn't considered. Now there's some key phrases in there I want to bring. Hello? It's still on. Oh, and it's still on. So they're going to be core to our understanding of how to design these conversations. So people of great decency, right? How often do we meet people we disagree with? And our assumption about them is that, oh, they can't have decency. If they did, they'd agree with me. Or wasn't a place, right? The locations we have to have these conversations maybe aren't really well designed for those kinds of conversations. And then best in each other. Again, even the idea that there is a best to bring out in that person that you disagree with. And finally, hadn't considered. And this is key. A lot of times we walk into these conversations thinking, we have considered everything. We already know the answer. What more is there to learn? They're the ones with the problem. Walking in realizing you might not actually have all the answers is kind of critical to the way this all works. So at the moment, our arena for political discourse looks something like this. This is Thunderdome from Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. Who remembers Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome? I'm sure. All right, cool. So it's basically a gladiatorial arena. 2 men enter, 1 man leave. That is the phrase from this. And that's kind of how we view political discourse today. We think of it as a zero-sum game. There has to be a winner and there has to be a loser. And part of the reason this happens is something called the fundamental attribution error. And I apologize in advance, you're going to get a whole lot of cognitive bias theory in here because I happen to do a podcast called the Cognitive Bias Podcast because I can't shut up about it. So you're going to get a little bit of that. Anyway, the fundamental attribution error at the end of the day is basically, I'm okay, you need work. So if you see someone run a red light, you might think, oh geez, that person's an irresponsible driver. They're dangerous. They shouldn't be on the road. Something is wrong with them. If you run a red light, I was late. There's somebody honking behind me, right? When it's someone else, you think about the person, something internal to them to understand why they did what they did. When it's you, you think about the circumstance. Oh, there was something external. It had nothing to do with me. Now think about this in the context of politics or things that we disagree about. There's a fantastic podcast called the You Are Not So Smart podcast, which I highly advise all of you to listen to. And when he was talking about this, he mentioned this routine by George Carlin, which goes something like this. Anybody who drives slower than you is an idiot. Anybody who drives faster than you is insane, right? Well, think about that in politics. Anybody who is more conservative than you is a bigot. There's some sort of old world, like I don't even understand. Anybody more liberal than you, oh, well, they're a hippy-dippy socialist. They're crazy. Their ideas will never work. But you're God's perfect creature. You've got it all figured out. And if only everyone would just do what you say, everything would be fine, right? Now imagine walking into a political discussion with someone who has that exact same mindset. Neither of you is going to accomplish anything. Put another way, right? So this is essentially the purpose of the internet, right? If aliens came down and tried to understand the purpose of the internet just by looking at how we behave on the internet, they would come to the conclusion that the internet is where you go to find people who are doing it wrong and tell them they're doing it wrong. A perfect example of this came out a few years ago. How many people remember this? Okay, so before Starbucks had their most recent run-in with race, they had another run-in with race. And they decided that they wanted to have a conversation with us about race. And they would write #RaceTogether on a coffee cup. Your barista would give you that coffee cup with the hashtag. And then, I don't know, you'd talk about Rodney King. I have no idea what was actually supposed to happen here. And frankly, neither did Starbucks. But what did happen was Twitter lost its mind, right? Which they should have. It was a pretty ridiculous, tone-deaf approach. But what didn't happen at any point during that was asking this question. What would a productive conversation about race actually look like? Like if this is what we don't want, well, what do we want? And if we could agree on that, well, then maybe we could talk about actually having one. Now, there are examples of the conversation itself being the product. So Ronnie Polineski is a Philadelphian who came to the conclusion that one of the core needs people have is to be heard. They just need to be heard. And so she went out to Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia and set up a sign and basically said, I will listen without judgment and just tell me what you need to say. Set that sign up, set out 2 chairs in the middle of the park and just sat there in one of the chairs. And sure enough, person after person sat down and unburdened themselves. And it's funny, when she tells the story, she says, basically someone would sit down and they'd lean in and say, all right, I'm just going to take a second of your time. And then an hour later, right? So that is what happens when you actually design, in this case, a physical environment for conversation. In fact, I did go to a Starbucks once, and there was a rabbi, at least I hope he was a rabbi because he said he was, a rabbi sat down with a sign that said, I am a rabbi, ask me anything, and people would come in and ask him questions, right? So even in Starbucks, you can design a good conversation, but you just have to do it the right way. Now, I'm going to use how we talk about race here as an example, but this isn't just race. This is anything we disagree about. We have very poor content strategies for topics we disagree about right now, and race is a perfect example. When somebody messes up around race, this is generally what we do, right? We ring the shame bell, which we should. It's a good thing to do, but unfortunately, it treats people who are trying to be hurtful exactly the same way as people who honestly are bad at talking about race, who genuinely want to have the conversation, but just suck at it. Because we assume that talking about race just comes naturally, but it's a skill. And like any skill, the only way you get good at it is by practicing. And what happens when you practice? You mess up. Knowing how not to do something is not the same as knowing how to, right? And the outrage ecosystem that we have, which is most of what the conversation we have online is right now, only tells you how not to do something. If I were trying to teach you how to drive a car and all I ever did was smack your hand every time you did something wrong, you would never learn how to drive a car. Let me give you another place where content strategy is failing us in this conversation. What's the opposite of a racist? What's that go-to word that everybody knows that's the opposite of a racist?
Mother Teresa.
It's about the closest we get, right? We don't even have the language to describe how to do it right, but we have so many words to describe how to do it wrong. And every person in this room knows if you don't have a word for a thing, you're not going to get that thing. If you don't know how to talk about it, and I'll give you a perfect example. I used to do a podcast that talked about how race was depicted in different film genres. And as a whim, I just decided to Google what films will make me less racist. This is what I got. Right? Now, every content strategist in the room right now should just be shivering. Like, as content strategists, one of the things we think about all the time is, what is the information that people want? And then what is the information available to answer that question? This is the exact opposite of that. I asked the question and got the exact opposite of what I needed. This is horrendous. But it's natural because the content we have about this is focused on that should, right? It's not focused on the how. And again, I do not anyone leaving here saying, oh, I went to LavaCon and this one black guy said it was okay to be racist. No! No! That is not what I'm saying. We should absolutely shut people down when they, act the fool on Twitter. Keep doing that, please. But we can't stop there. In fact, if that's all we ever do, the best we can hope for is a bureaucracy. Because that's essentially what a bureaucracy is. It is a setup to make sure nobody messes up. And so what does everybody focus on? Not messing up. That's not racial progress. Another problem with that approach is another cognitive bias. I warned you, I'm going to throw these out there. It's called reactance. And please, please find me after and talk to me about reactance because it is the wackiest cognitive bias you will ever find. But at the end of the day, it's basically the you can't tell me what to do bias. If I were to put a sign on that wall that said, please do not write on this wall, and then I put a sign on that wall that says, under no circumstances should you write on this wall, guess which wall will get the most graffiti, right? And this is an actual experiment. They've seen this happen, right? You can't, and you especially can't tell Americans, you cannot tell us what to do. So when political correctness came out, basically as a list of things not to do, it was doomed to fail because that was all it was providing. And what that really boils down to is you get the conversation you design for. The content strategy behind the design for that conversation matters. And the visual combination of the content strategy and the visual design matters too. So when Amazon first came out with its review system, the way they would display reviews, they basically would put the most recent review first, right? It's the natural way you did blogs. Only problem with this is people would look at that review and assume, oh, well, that's the first review. It must be the most authoritative because we have little lizard brains. It's just how we work. It's called primacy. So they said, oh, you know what? We're going to invent this thing called helpfulness. What's the most helpful and the least helpful? And we're going to bubble up the most helpful review, and that's the one we'll put at the top. It's better, but people still assumed, oh, the top review is a positive review, I guess it's positive. I guess it's a good product, right? Oh, it's negative? Oh, it must be a negative product. So what they ultimately had to do was to put the most helpful positive review and the most helpful negative review side by side. They had to give them equal visual weight so that your mind would give them equal visual weight. And you would say, oh, I have to consider both sides of this. The design influenced the conversation. And it gets deeper. Color makes a difference. So there's an experiment where you give people tasks, different cognitive tasks. And some of them are very detail-oriented, like I want you to proofread this. And others are more creative, like I want you to come up with cool new ideas for this thing. Now the people given the detail-oriented tasks, when the task had a red background, they did 30% better. 30% better at proofreading when they were asked to do it with a red background versus a blue background. If it was a creative task like brainstorming, they came up with twice as many ideas when it was a blue background instead of a red background. So if you're trying to design a collaboration space where people have to come up with new ideas, guess which color you're probably going to pick? This shouldn't be a surprise. The setting dictates the conversation in real life. If I were to go to a very fancy restaurant with soft music playing and beautiful tablecloths, I wouldn't think, oh, this is a place where I should curse as loudly as possible, right? However, if I went to a dingy bar, if I went to Bourbon Street perhaps, I might think this place wants me to curse as loud as possible, right? Now think about the design of different interfaces, right? If I go to Medium, and there are those cool blues and greens and the beautiful typeface, right? This is a place that is telling me I kind of need to up my game if I'm going to comment here. If I go to some place like YouTube comments, right, or Reddit comments, there is nothing about this design that's telling me to behave myself. What this design is saying is we put the least amount of effort possible into how this place looks, so you should put the least amount of effort possible into how you conduct yourself. And don't fool yourself into thinking that it's just about anonymity, right? Oh, well, the reason people are misbehaving is because they get to hide behind an avatar. Unfortunately, people are terrible when they use their real names as well. Not so long ago, Monica Lewinsky gave a TED Talk. And the comment section for that TED Talk is one of the most horrendous things you will ever read. So bad that TED actually wrote a blog post talking about how they had to react to this situation. Now on TED, you got to use your real name. What does make a difference, or at the very least is important to get right, is setting the standard, right? If you have any kind of interface where there's going to be discussion, open discussion, you need to put down the law of the land. You need to say, okay, this is what will get you kicked out. This is what we agree that we want or don't want. And there's two reasons to do this. One is so that you internally, your team, can actually come to alignment about that sort of thing. I'm pretty sure everyone here is down with the notion of it's good to write things down so everyone can agree on them, right? This goes for community standards as well. But also, if you do have a position where, oh, we have to kick this person off, you can at least point to something to say, and this is why we did it. So what can we do? I would be remiss if I had this whole talk about, hey, we need to collaborate and come up with the solutions, and then say, okay, good luck with that. There actually are a lot of things you can do. And this is why I'm so excited to give this talk, is every time I do it, I challenge everyone in the audience to at least contribute to one of these ideas. So first off, we can call out good behavior. What's the last great comment you saw? Where are the top 10 comments of the year awards, right? If you start doing stuff like that, you will have people commenting thinking, I could win that award, right? And they up their game. The thing that you celebrate, you see more of. My small attempt at this was last year I created a hashtag called Woke Cinema, and every day I posted a new movie that I thought was addressing race or mental illness or poverty or gender in some interesting, constructive way, right? It's the opposite of the 10 most racist films list. Now, you can tell if you go look up the hashtag Woke Cinema that my efforts were not successful, but at least I was contributing to the bucket of content that was how and not should. Another fascinating take on this is called civil comments. So this is a plugin where you put it into your comments section, and if anyone wants to comment, they have to rate 2 other comments first. Now this does 3 things. 1, it forces them to acknowledge that there's such a thing as a good or a bad comment. Surprisingly, a lot of people don't think that's a thing. 2, it forces them to apply their own standard, and this is immensely powerful. You will adhere to your own standard more so than to any standard anyone else comes up with. And here's the proof. Harvard a while back tried to figure out how can you keep people from cheating on tests. What's the one silver bullet most effective thing? As it turns out, it's to make them sign a pledge saying they will not cheat on the test. This is more effective than like standing over them or putting cameras in the classroom. If they sign that pledge, they are far, far less likely to actually cheat on that test. And it's because there's a cognitive dissonance to saying I'm going to do a thing and signing it and then doing something opposite. We just don't like doing it. So when they would rate those other comments and see, oh, that's not a great comment, and they look at their own comment and see, oh, I did that too, they would change. And in fact, something like 60% of people who rated comments would go change their own comment before they posted. And then the third thing it would do is make them realize, oh yeah, someone's going to rate my comment someday. I'm going to make this good. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is civil comments went out of business. They could not find an effective business model. And one of the important caveats to everything I'm talking about here is that it's not always going to be about making money. When I gave this talk earlier and I told that story, a guy named Chris Alfano, who works for Code for Philly, said, we need more tools than there are business models for. So this may be one of those public highway moments where it's like, okay, someone's got to make this because it has to be made. So just keep that in mind. Rethink. A 14-year-old figured this out. Rethink is a pop-up, right? You're about to post something hateful on Twitter or Facebook. You hit send, and before it actually sends, a little pop-up comes up and says, this looks like it might be hurtful. Are you sure you want to send it? 90% of the people who saw that pop-up didn't hit send. Now this tells us two things. One, 90%, most of the people out there aren't actually evil, they're thoughtless. It simply doesn't occur to them that there's a human being on the other end of that hateful thing. And as soon as they figure that out, they stop. The other thing it tells us is it takes 2 sentences to stop them. 2. We've been sitting here lamenting the state of public discourse and social media. Oh my God, what are we going to do? 2 sentences. She figured this out when she was 14. So we have no excuse. Another tool that we have, and every writer in this room should think about this, is how we phrase our questions. So I talked before about the Convergence Center, right? They bring people who are on opposite sides of the table together. One of their key tools is how they phrase their questions. So if they were dealing with a food desert, you might think, oh, the question on the table is how can we get healthier food into the supermarket? Unfortunately, strange as it may sound, this is a very divisive question. However, if I say, how can we work together to shift consumer demand to healthier consumption? Well, I'm a marketer. Whenever I hear the words shift consumer demand, my ears perk up because, oh, that sounds like a white space to me. I could be first to market with that. Okay, tell me how I can help. If I'm a health advocate, I hear healthier consumption. I think, oh, I want there to be healthier consumption. How can I help? And even the way the question is phrased, right out of the gate, how can we work together? You can't answer the question without also describing working together. Let's go back to our first question. How might this person drive this car? It's a fine enough question in and of itself, but what if we asked, how do we do a better job of moving people? Right? Because the reason he's in the car in the first place is because he's here and he wants to be there. And if I ask this question, all of a sudden things like public transportation are on the table. In a world where we can basically upvote or downvote things, just react in binary to the things that we see that make us angry or we disagree about, what if what we actually could do is a third option of just solve it or work on it or come up with an idea, an ideate button? And what would that button do? Well, I can tell you what it might do in real life. So this is an exercise, and it's a collaboration exercise that we actually did here at LavaCon a few years ago. Jack was a part of it, to generate ideas for a content strategy for LavaCon. And it's very simple. You get 8 people in a room, and you say to those 8 people, okay, I want you to write down 3 ideas for how we might do a better job of moving people, right? Each individual person writes down 3 ideas. You've got 3 minutes, write down your 3 ideas. Great, 3 minutes are up. Wonderful. Turn to the person next to you, show them your 3 ideas. They will show you their 3 ideas. Take those 6 ideas, whittle them down to 2. You got 10 minutes. Do it? Great. This pair, you've got 2 ideas. Pair next to you's got 2 ideas. show them your ideas, take those 4 ideas, whittle them down to 2. Pretty soon now we've got one group of 4 with 2 ideas, another group of 4 with 2 ideas. All 8 of you now take those 4 ideas, whittle them down to 1. Now this is a tried and true method for coming up with great ideas, and sociologists have looked at this. If I were to do the same thing and say, hey, 8 people, come up with a good idea, we're going to vote and pick that best idea, you get a mediocre idea. Or I say, hey, all 8 of you, go in this room, don't come out until you've come up with a good idea, you get a mediocre idea. But if you gradually combine those approaches, right, a few things happen. One, any of the hippos in the room, are we familiar with the term hippos? Highest paid person, loudmouth. They don't get to dominate the conversation until very far into the process, right? 2, you get the ground truth of everybody in that room in that final idea, which is why it's very important to have those 8 people be as diverse as possible, come from as diverse backgrounds as possible. And finally, since everyone's DNA is in the final idea, they have way more buy-in to that idea. So I can give you all sorts of examples later of like how to implement this and how it works, why it's valuable. This works great in person. I challenge everyone here to figure out how do we do this online? How do we press that ideate button and have this interface pop up, and I can team up with people and try to generate ideas. Another thing we can do is to start using design language for things other than strictly speaking design. So are people familiar with user stories, the phrase user stories? Pretty good number, okay. So for those of you who don't know, they generally follow the cadence of as a blank, I would like to blank so that I can blank, right? So if I'm creating a feature for iTunes, it might be as a iTunes user, I would like to recommend songs to my friends so I can look smart. What if we use things other than design language? Right? As a woman, I like to be paid much as a man so that I can pay off my student loans. We can start to frame these things as solvable things and not just as terrible things. A sort of nod in this direction is called problems-based procurement. So this is something that's happening in some cities. I'm proud to say Philly's getting behind it. Typically, the procurement process, if I'm a city and I need new streetlights, looks something like this. Okay. We need streetlights, they need to be this tall. Here's a 50-page document that describes exactly how tall they need to be, how much power they need to use, how far apart they're spaced, how much electricity, boom, 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 all the specs. I describe the solution in exact detail, and then the same 5 bidders who always bid on it, lowest bid wins, right? That's the typical procurement process. Problems-based procurement says, it's dark at night and we would like to see, go, right? Now, I'm just describing the problem. You have to describe the solution, right? And now all of a sudden, a lot more players can come to the table. And hey, if it turns out that the most effective solution is to give everyone night vision goggles, great, that's what we're going to do. In general, we need to start thinking about how to use design approaches when we're thinking about things like policy. Human-centered design, design thinking, at the end of the day, these boil down to the basic concept of if you are going to build something for somebody, talk to them first, right? It has taken a very long time for this to bleed over into public policy, but it's an approach we can start to take now that we've refined it a bit in the private sector. Marvelous technology is at our disposal, and instead of reaching up for new heights, we try to see how far down we can go. This is a quote from Eric Bogosian, Talk Radio. He was talking about talk radio back in the 80s, but he might as well have been talking about today. So with the notion of trying to get us closer to that productive conversation, I'd like to propose 3 rules of productive discourse before I go. These are agreements we can enter into when we're going to have these conversations that are geared toward actually collaborating and building something new instead of just yelling at each other. And rule number 1 is, neither of us has the answer. If we did, we wouldn't actually be having this conversation. We don't argue about whether or not there's gravity, because there is. We don't argue about what water is, because we've figured that one out already. Clearly, we haven't figured this one out yet. Neither of us will win. This is a hard one, but it's vital. Because neither of us is actually here to win. That's not what we're here to do. And in fact, winning doesn't actually help that much. All it really does is make one of us feel better until the problem rears its ugly head again because we were too busy winning to actually solve it. Finally, we are here to create something new. This assumes the best in each other, that we each have something to contribute to this thing that didn't exist before. So the next time you see somebody doing it wrong, ask yourself, is there a how conversation to be had? Thank you.